come full circle in this session, this second part of the session. We started this morning with Kelly looking at the big picture of impact science. We dived down into molecular mechanisms, and now we're going to come back to whole organisms with the next two talks. The first one, not by Liza Minnelli, but by Julie Mennella, who is from the wonderful Mennella Chemical Senses Center, wonderful institute doing some remarkable research. The title of her talk is Development of Sweet Taste Preferences, the Vulnerabilities of Childhood. So there's that, and we've got some water.
Perfect.
And
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I've really been looking forward to this symposium since being invited several months ago, and it hasn't disappointed. What first things first, let's see if it's advanced. My funding's from NIH, so no conflicts of interest. But to try to get the big picture of all of this, obviously my point of view is going to be talking about development and taste. But many chronic diseases that plague modern society derive in large part by poor food choices, which we've heard about this morning. And all of those are dictated by our taste preferences. Some of the work that came out of the FIT study showed that from the age of 2 years, an American is more likely to consume a manufactured sweet than a fruit or vegetable on a given day. That's from 2 years up. The more added sugar in the diet, the poorer the diet quality. And as you know from Emily Oken's work, the lower the cognitive skills and other adverse effects that we heard a lot about this morning. Majority of toddlers are consuming added sugar on a given day. They're eating much more than is recommended, almost double the amount. And along with that, non-nutritive sweetener intake, as you heard from Dr. Gorin, is also increasing among children. So while fruit increased slightly, vegetable intake remained about the same if we're looking at their diet habits, but most importantly, both fruit and vegetable are well below what's recommended. And I'm going to get to that at the end. I just wanted to plant this seed, if you will. So one of the questions is, how can you account for patterns of food choice that are so antithetical to health? And why is it so difficult to change? I mean, I think that is the fundamental question. And what I hope to show you today by reviewing some of the basic research that's been done on children is that there's a mismatch of inborn, probably evolutionary-driven preferences that the baby has that's quite evident early in life and the current food environment. And I think there's another flip of that coin, and that there are detrimental consequences of not being exposed to the foods that we may need to learn to like, quote unquote, considered some of the healthy foods that may be varied in a lot of texture and other type, and lower in sweetness, or sometimes even bitter. You learn to like what you eat. So this I was recently came across this article. It was written quite a while ago, but this is a picture of the Nutcracker Man. And he's kind of is the theme of this talk that I want to give to you today. He was discovered by the Leakeys, and he got this nickname because he obviously has this big jaw that was made to crack nuts. And so anthropologists at Oklahoma, I believe, and the National Science Foundation drew the picture of this after their findings that were published. Looked at the dentition of Nutcracker Man, and he wasn't eating nuts in the days before he died. He was eating fruits. And so there was big headings all over Science, early humans love fruits. And so one of the things that we have to, and you've heard about this in other talks, is but to think of where we came from, and where the child came from, if you will, look at our past. And we, as Dr. Popkins talked about, we evolved in fluctuating, uncertain environments. And our primary challenge was to obtain enough nutrients, avoid that which is poisonous, and these challenges are especially great for the child. And so in response to these challenges, we have this elegant biology of a taste and a flavor system that evolved to detect that which we need, these once rare calorie-rich foods, or sodium, which is a needed mineral, and while rejecting the potential toxins that are bitter. It's not to say we can't learn to like bitter, but we first have to learn that it's safe. And so what I would say is understanding what children are eating, or understanding any of the things that we're talking about as sugar, is we have to incorporate this biological substrate. We don't taste with these, we taste with the brain, but this is where, in the periphery, is where a lot of this starts. And these senses are central to identifying food, which is a basic biological commodity. And as you know, you could look at any food and health survey that has been done on why people buy things. It is how it tastes. Taste, as they say, remains the king in purchasing decisions and consumption decisions. So when we think about the taste that we're interested in this symposium, which is sweet, is this information begins in the periphery, where these sweet-tasting ligands are binding to this dimer of T1Rs, and they're relaying that to signals to many parts of the brain. And it is our oldest reward. Many drugs of abuse are co-opting these brain pathways that were designed for sweet. It's not the other way around. Tasting something sweet, is the elegant work of Kent Berridge at Michigan, stimulates dopamine signaling in the ventrum striatum, other areas of the brain, but many that are involved in both reward and learning. And this, I think, is particularly salient to the learning child. So what I want, the sense of taste, the sense of sweet taste, is really benefited from maybe a century-long legacy of basic research in infants and children. And what I want to do is just give just a brief review of some of that science about how sweet taste, the salience of it. But of course, all science started with Darwin. No, I'm just joking. But when you look at the biological sketch of an infant, even he observed that children are living in their own sensory world. I particularly like this because I was doing some work on sour taste, where but he often talks about how they like the things that are so sweet it might be sickening to you and me. But this really is at the hallmark of the developmental changes in taste, is children prefer much higher levels of sweet than adults, changing during mid-adolescence. So what's the basic research? So it's a pretty international body of research. This is some of the early work that was done at Mennella, basically doing 2-bottle preference tests in hour-old infants, showing that not only can they detect the sugar water, but they preferred it and ingested more when compared to water. If you look at, this is the work of Rick Mattis and Teresa Mayoni and Gary Beecham at Mennella. Is this ability to detect sweet present before birth? And the way they asked it was by embedding sweetness into a nipple, because premature infants have a risk of aspiration. And as you can see in the trace C and D, that's the premature infant, where C is the plain one and D is the sweetened one, although their suck is much weaker than the term infant, which is the plain is A and the sweetened nipple is B, is that they suck harder when given so the ability to detect and to behaviorally respond to sweet is evident in the 25 to 36 week, though, premature infant. So you can see this increased sucking, and you see this in the term infant. These facial expressions that are phylogenetically well conserved, the face relaxes, you often will get a sucking response in infants when some sweetness thing is put in the oral cavity. And it also blunts expressions of pain. This probably is the most international. It doesn't work as good as the recent Cochrane review showed for needle-induced pain, but it has an analgesic effect, or a pain-reducing effect. There's very few research studies on infants and non-nutritive sweeteners, but this study was done to show, is it a post-ingestive effect of the sugars having its effect on the pain-reducing properties of sweetness, if you will. And this showed that the effect of aspartame was similar to sucrose, whether it was the decreased crying, was it the hand-to-mouth movements. So that's where they were able to conclude it was a sweetness effect. So this liking for this ability to detect and to respond, behaviorally, differentially respond to sweet is present at birth, if not. And when one thinks of that which a human infant needed to survive, it's attracted to the predominant taste quality of human milk. And then while the child grows, again, it's a quite elegant biology, is attracting them to sources of energy, which were fruit. And it's heightened during periods of maximal growth. So when you get to older children, they obviously can do a lot more sophisticated psychophysical tools. And when we use the word sweet preference, we might not be, really advancing the case as much, because there's many different phenotypes when it comes to sweet taste preference. You can measure many different things for all behaviors. And I think it's important to really, what is it that one is measuring and what is that relating to? So one of the things that we've looked at is, this is a forced choice tracking procedure. You could do it in children as young as 3. It controls for position bias, so you can tell if the child understands it. But it really is measuring what's the level of a taste, whether it's salt or sweet, that's most preferred. And since I've been doing this work for the last 20 years, it's really been pretty stable. As you'll see, children prefer much higher levels of sweet taste than adults, and they also prefer much higher levels of salt taste than adults. And it changes during mid-adolescence. To give you, we've also looked at a number of other sugars, which I'll talk about. They have a higher preference for fructose as well. One of the things that we did is to, this was designed for fruits, and with colleagues at the University of Florida, they sent us 3 cultivars of blueberries during the harvest season. We knew roughly the sugar content, and we asked children and adults this a number of ways, but the one thing that I thought was interesting, because I often think that you have to ask the child the question a number of ways, is that even though the berries were very similar in sugar content, one was higher than the other, children could really, the ones that they preferred were the variety that had the higher sugar content. No matter how you ask them, you could have a ranked preference, which blueberry do you want to take home, or a whole variety of different type of tastes. So I think they're really tuned into sweetness, and you can ask this a variety of ways. Now, these are all the countries in which there's been basic research that children of those countries prefer higher levels of sweet than adults. Again, I think it was designed to attract them to things that they needed to eat during periods of growth. I recently taught someone Harriet Okoniba, who's working with Kay Dewey, who's doing a Gates project in Ghana, and they were looking at the effect of feeding a supplement to sweet preferences in children who were like 3 to 6 years of age. But the thing that struck me is that the level that was most preferred among these Ghanaian children is exactly the same as what I see among Philadelphia children, which is much higher than the adult. So to give you an idea of what children like, now adults like the level of sweetness that is in, let's say, a can of a carbonated beverage. It's no surprise they probably did a lot of sensory panel work to get at the level that adults like. And that level, as you know, is about 9 cubes of sugar, 7 cubes of sugar in an 8-ounce glass of water. For children, it's 12. They really like that. And I can show you a lot of different graphs, but I think this also isn't a salient feature. This is a little girl tasting sweet juice for the first time in our laboratory. Not only do you get it, but she's the first one that really danced. And just to show that it's not like she likes everything, here's her tasting a broccoli juice.